Welcome to the channel. Tonight, we are going to talk about rules. Not the grand constitutional kind that live under glass in Washington, visited by tourists who crane their necks and squint at faded handwriting behind thick protective barriers. Not the kind of rules that come with portraits and famous speeches attached. We are talking about the other kind. The kind that made ordinary people stop in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and say, out loud, to whoever happened to be nearby, "What on earth is the government doing now?" The kind of rules that got printed in newspapers with headlines practically screaming bewilderment. The kind that inspired cartoons and editorials and passionate letters to congressmen written in that particular tone of high dudgeon that Americans have, across every era, done so very well. The kind of rules that got nicknames. The kind that got repealed, sometimes, and then quietly reinstated under a different name a few decades later, because the problem they were trying to solve had not gone anywhere. And yet, almost every single one of these rules had a reason. Not always a noble reason. Not always just reason. Not always a reason that worked the way its architects intended. But somewhere behind each one of these strange, seemingly absurd pieces of legislation was a genuine problem. A fire that needed putting out. A crisis building slowly or suddenly in the streets and factories and hospitals and kitchens of a country that was, in almost every era of its history, considerably more fragile and considerably more anxious than its official self-image would ever suggest. Tonight, we are going to take a slow, unhurried walk through some of the most peculiar rules in American history. We're going to look at laws about the ground itself, about what you could send in the mail, about what you could eat and drink, about where you were allowed to walk, at what speed you were permitted to drive, about what you could do on a Sunday, and about the remarkable moment when the federal government looked at the entire concept of mourning and decided it was happening at the wrong time on behalf of a country that had not asked for mournings to be reconsidered. We're going to discover that most of these rules, frustrating and strange, and sometimes quite deeply flawed as they were, grew out of something real, something that was hurting people, or breaking communities, or threatening a country that was reaching for its ideals with one hand, while dealing with very difficult realities with the other. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is exactly what it sounds like. Long, slow, calm documentary storytelling, designed for relaxed listening. For those evenings when the day needs to dissolve slowly and sleep needs a little quiet company. If you enjoy this kind of unhurried historical wandering, please consider hitting like and subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might imagine, and this community of late-night history listeners is one of the most quietly wonderful things about making these episodes. Drop a comment somewhere below letting us know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Whether you're lying in bed somewhere in the American Midwest, or listening from a flat in London, or anywhere else in the comfortable darkness of the world's evening. Hello. We are very glad you're here. Now, if you haven't done it yet, dim the lights just a bit. Find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take one easy breath in and let it out slowly. Tonight, we begin with the land, with the ground beneath your feet, before anything was built on it. Because one of the most extraordinary, most quietly consequential, most mathematically rigorous decisions in American history was not about war or industry or politics or religion in the way we usually tell those stories. It was about the shape of an empty field and the precise distance between two survey stakes. It was about a government that was almost completely broke, staring at an enormous expanse of wilderness and trying to figure out how to turn it into something usable without losing its organizational mind entirely in the process. And what they came up with was a grid. Settle in. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest in what is now Ohio, not modern Ohio, with its familiar highway exits and clusters of franchise restaurants and quiet, continuous hum of suburban traffic somewhere in the middle distance. We are standing in 1785, and the forest in front of you goes on further than you can think. The trees are old enough that your hands would not meet around the trunks. The understory is a tangle of shadow and fallen wood, and things moving through it that you are probably better off not investigating too carefully. Somewhere overhead, the canopy is filtering the morning light into something diffuse and green and cool. The air smells of bark and wet leaves and particular mineral sharpness that comes from deep soil that has never been turned. Behind you, off to the east, is what is left of the young United States of America, 13 former colonies that have just survived an extraordinarily expensive revolution, and which are now sitting with a debt problem that keeps everyone in the Continental Congress quietly awake at night. The country needed money, not in a vague, long-term planning kind of way, in a right now, immediately. The soldiers are still waiting for the land they were promised kind of way. Revolutionary War veterans had been assured land as compensation for their service. Foreign creditors were waiting. The new government had essentially no reliable source of income because the Constitution had not yet been written, and the power to collect reliable federal taxes was still being argued about in meeting rooms that smelled of candle wax and mutual suspicion. What the government did have, however, was this: land, vast, almost incomprehensible quantities of land to the west, formerly ceded by Britain in the Treaty of Paris 2 years earlier, the Northwest Territory, a region larger than France, stretching from the Ohio River northward to the Great Lakes and beyond, containing more potential farmland, more timber, more waterways than most people in the young country could easily imagine from the eastern seaboard. The question was how to sell it. You cannot sell something that nobody can describe. You cannot issue a deed for land that has no official boundaries. You cannot settle competing claims to a piece of territory unless someone has formally determined where that territory begins and ends. And the Northwest Territory in 1785 was officially described as follows: very large, mostly forested, exact contents unknown. The answer, shaped primarily through the thinking of Thomas Jefferson and passed by Congress as the Land Ordinance of 1785, was one of the most rigidly mathematical responses to a wilderness problem in human history. A grid, not a rough approximation, not a general organizational idea, an actual precise 6 miles by 6 miles grid, laid directly onto the surface of the Northwest Territory regardless of what hills, rivers, swamps, or forests the territory itself might have preferred. The grid divided the land into townships. Each township was then divided into 36 sections, each exactly 1 mile square. Each section contained exactly 640 acres. Any piece of land could be identified by its township number, its range, and its section number, and the description would be legally defensible in court anywhere in the country. The surveying teams that went out to implement this plan encountered the full cooperation of the Ohio wilderness, which is to say they encountered swamps of uncertain depth, rivers that appeared on no map and refused to stay in their banks, hills that the plan had not budgeted for, and insects of a quantity and personal determination that the people who designed the grid from their comfortable offices had presumably not needed to consider. The work was painstaking. Survey teams dragged chains across the ground to measure distances with the required precision. Compasses were consulted constantly and checked against celestial observations at night. Corners were marked with stakes and mounds of earth, and when a suitable tree was nearby, a blaze cut into the bark. The whole operation moved at approximately 1 mile per day under ideal conditions, and considerably slower under conditions that actually prevailed in the Ohio interior in the 1780s. Here is where the rule becomes genuinely peculiar, viewed from the outside. The grid was flat. The earth is not. The earth curves in a way that spheres curve, gently and continuously, in every direction. Any set of parallel lines drawn on flat paper will, when laid out on the surface of a sphere, eventually converge. The north-south survey lines, if extended far enough without adjustment, would slowly drift toward each other the way lines of longitude converge toward the poles. Left uncorrected, the beautiful precision of the 6-mile township will become quietly imprecise over distance, accumulating error the way a slightly misaligned compass accumulates it over miles. The surveyors knew this. The solution was what they called correction lines. Places in the survey where the grid would jump slightly east or west compensate for the curvature of the earth, and then continue straight again. These correction lines were built into the system from the beginning, and the result is visible today. On any satellite map of the American Midwest, or from the window of a plane crossing Kansas or Iowa, you can see it. A road that runs perfectly straight for miles will, at a specific interval, jog sideways by precisely the correction distance, and then continue straight as if the interruption was entirely normal. If you have ever been driving through flat country and experienced a road that took a brief, unexplained sideways step and then resumed, you have felt the curvature of the earth expressed in asphalt. The earth is a sphere. The road is telling you this quietly at the correction line. Now, the rule that every township had to reserve its Section 16, always the center section of the grid, specifically for the support of public schools, deserves more attention than it usually receives. That section was not available for sale. The income from its lease or eventual sale went directly to fund education in that community, by law, permanently. Jefferson and the Congress of the Confederation were making an explicit statement. Land carried an obligation to the community that would eventually live on it. An educated population could govern itself. A population that could govern itself had less need of the kind of authority it had just fought a war to escape. The schoolhouse was not an amenity. It was the whole point. The grid shaped everything that came after. The way townships were organized, the way farms were laid out, the way roads were built, because roads followed section lines, which ran due north and south and east and west without exception. The American tendency to build cities on strict grids, while older cities wound organically along cattle paths and river bends, is partly philosophical, partly practical, and substantially the direct inheritance of a mathematical decision made by a nearly bankrupt government staring at a forest in 1785. The wilderness of Ohio is suburban now. The section lines are county roads. Section 16 schoolhouse has been replaced by something considerably larger, with a parking lot and a gymnasium, and the grid stretches on all the way to the horizon, the most ambitious piece of graph paper ever laid on the surface of the earth. But while Congress was organizing the land with mathematics, American society was organizing personal honor with a different kind of system, a private code, one that had developed its own rules, its own protocols, and its own designated time of day, and which was, from a governmental perspective, producing a serious and frustrating problem. It involved two men in a field and the particular quality of light that comes just before sunrise in New Jersey in July. The morning fog is low over a clearing in Weehawken, New Jersey. The date is the 11th of July, 1804. The grass is heavy with dew, and the cold of it is already worked through to your shoes. Somewhere above the tree line, the sky is lightening in the slow way of early July mornings, gray giving way to something warmer at the edges. You are about to watch two of the most consequential men in America shoot at each other. Aaron Burr is the sitting Vice President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton is a former Secretary of the Treasury, one of the principal architects of the American financial system, and a man whose face will one day appear on the $10 bill, though at this particular moment in his life that distinction remains some distance ahead of him and is not, clearly, how things are going. The dispute between them was long, complicated, and rooted in the accumulated friction of two careers that had occupied the same political landscape for decades. A letter that Hamilton had written concerning Burr's character during a New York gubernatorial election had been quoted in a newspaper. Burr demanded a full accounting. Hamilton declined to provide one specific enough to satisfy. Burr sent a formal challenge. Hamilton accepted. And so here they are in New Jersey at dawn, doing what educated American gentlemen of the early 19th century had established as the appropriate response to disputes that conversation had failed to resolve. Hamilton fires first, whether he deliberately aimed wide, into the air or into a tree above Burr's head. Accounts differ, and the question has been argued by historians for 2 centuries. Burr does not fire wide. Hamilton falls. He died the following afternoon, in the bed of a friend in New York City, displaying what those present described as remarkable composure for a man who had been shot to the liver by the sitting vice president. Burr was subsequently charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey. He returned to Washington, resumed his duties as presiding officer of the Senate, and completed the remainder of his term in that role while simultaneously under indictment for murder in 2 states. The Senate, as an institution, managed to function through this. Whether the atmosphere in the chamber was somewhat unusual during this period is not well documented, though one imagines it was at least occasionally quiet. Now, dueling sounds, from a vantage of 2 centuries, like an elaborate and obviously preventable form of organized catastrophe. 2 educated men in a field with loaded weapons, risking their lives over remarks made in a letter that could have been discussed over dinner. The entire system seems like something that could have been avoided at almost any point before the actual firing. But dueling was not a rare aberration in early America. It was a recognized, socially structured, and widely practiced method of managing conflict of honor among the propertied and educated classes. It had rules. It had witnesses, called seconds, whose formal role included attempting to negotiate a resolution that made the shooting unnecessary. It had an established etiquette about how challenges were issued, how responses were delivered, how far apart the participants stood, and what counted as a satisfactory outcome short of fatality. The code that governed these encounters had been imported from Europe, refined in Ireland into the Code Duello of 1777, and transplanted to America by officers and gentlemen, for whom it represented an essential element of civilized masculine honor. Between the Revolution and the middle of the 19th century, historians estimate that somewhere in the region of 100 prominent Americans were killed in formal duels. These were not ambushes or brawls. They were arranged encounters consented by both parties, conducted according to rules of engagement, in front of witnesses, with someone nearby to summon a doctor in the apparently optimistic belief that a doctor could help. The men dying were doctors and lawyers and politicians and military officers and newspaper editors. The men dying were precisely the men that a young republic needed alive, trained, experienced, and functional. States began outlawing dueling at different speeds and with different levels of conviction. Ohio passed a ban in 1819, Virginia banned in 1810, and then enforced that ban with enthusiasm that can charitably be described as minimal. Tennessee passed a law barring anyone who participated in a duel from holding public office, which was a creative approach, though its deterrent effect in a culture where not accepting a challenge was considered a form of professional suicide was somewhat limited. Andrew Jackson participated in multiple duels. He killed a man. He carried a bullet close to his heart for the rest of his life from another encounter. He was subsequently elected president of the United States twice, which tells you something about the complicated relationship between the anti-dueling laws and the culture they were trying to change. What actually ended dueling in America was less legislation than cultural drift, happening slowly across several decades. The practice began to seem increasingly theatrical as the century progressed. The newspapers that had once covered duels with the same matter-of-fact seriousness as ship arrivals and auction notices began to treat them with a slight, unmistakable note of absurdity. Cartoons appeared. The elaborate ritual that one generation found gravely necessary began to look, to the next generation, like two grown men with expensive pistols performing a very dangerous piece of theater about nothing. The Civil War seems to have removed a considerable amount of romance from the idea of men shooting at each other for personal satisfaction. After 1865, formal civilian dueling in America was largely a historical memory, persisting mainly in the southern states in attenuated cultural forms that were not quite the old code but retained some of the assumptions about honor and confrontation. The anti-dueling laws mattered most in the way that law often matters most quietly. They changed the official position of the state. They said in writing that private codes of violence had no legitimate role in resolving disputes among citizens of a republic. They shifted the authority over what justice looked like from private codes to public courts. And the death of Alexander Hamilton, specifically, had concentrated public attention on the issue in a way that general statistics about prominent men killing each other in fields had not quite managed. The outrage was substantial. The calls for stronger, more consistently enforced laws became louder, more organized, and harder to dismiss. The fog has burned off now over the field in Weehawken. The morning has fully arrived, and in the cities being built on that great mathematical grid, cities growing rapidly, filling with workers and families and particular pressures of industrial life, a different kind of rule was quietly organizing the rhythm of the week itself, a rule about which day belonged to God, and what happened if you tried to do your laundry on that day instead. It is a Sunday morning in Boston, sometime around 1850. The bells of 3 different churches are layering their competing summons across the still air, each one tuned slightly differently, and the sound of them carries further than usual, because the streets are almost entirely silent. No carts, no vendors, no particular commercial energy of any kind. The bakeries are dark behind their windows. The taverns are shut, their doors locked with an air of official moral conviction. The cheerful transactional hum that makes weekday Boston feel like a city in continuous motion has gone somewhere else and left this particular quiet behind. You are standing at the window of your boarding house room, running a mental inventory of what you bought yesterday. Because today, in most American cities of the mid-19th century, almost everything is closed. By law, these were the blue laws. The name is old enough that its precise origins are disputed. One popular theory holds that the earliest Connecticut laws were printed on blue paper, giving them their color and their nickname. What is more certain is their contents. Comprehensive restrictions on commercial activity, on work, on travel, on recreation, and in some cases on personal behavior, all designated for the day that Puritan New England had collectively determined belonged exclusively to the organized worship of God. The earliest American blue laws date to the colonial period, and they were specific in ways that reward a moment of careful attention. Connecticut's code in the 1600s prohibited most forms of work on Sunday, along with cooking, traveling, making beds, sweeping floors, cutting hair, shaving, and kissing one's spouse, which gives you some sense of how seriously the Puritan settlement took its day of rest. One law prohibited the gathering of clams or mussels on Sunday. Another restricted walking except to and from church. The general theory was that God's day should be entirely liberated from the material concerns of earthly life, including apparently the concern of having clean hair. From the 21st century looking back, the blue laws read straightforwardly as religious tyranny. A theocratic majority using the force of civil law to impose its Sabbath practices on an entire community regardless of faith, using the threat of fines and community censure to enforce a religious observance that not everyone shared. This is, in some respects, a fair reading. But here's what the blue laws were also doing, particularly after the Industrial Revolution began reshaping American working life in the first half of the 19th century. A factory worker's week in 1850 was not 7 days in the technical sense. It was 6 days, long ones. 12 hours was a standard shift in a well-run mill. 14 hours was not unusual in a poorly run one or during a busy season. The factory was indifferent to the state of your body, to your family obligations, to the accumulating weight of physical labor on muscles and joints that had not been given adequate recovery time. The factory cared about the output of its machines, and you were one of them. The Sunday closing laws, whatever their theological origin, and however sincere the religious conviction behind them, were one of the only guaranteed breaks in the working week that most industrial laborers had. Not because mill owners were generous with their workers' time, because the law said Sunday was closed, and that was not a number the mill owner could renegotiate in exchange for slightly higher piece rates. Without the blue laws, the logic of industrial capitalism pointed directly at 7-day operation. If you could sell 7 days of production, why sell 6? If the machinery could run on Sunday, why let it sit? The workers who were too tired to organize, too poor to refuse overtime, too economically dependent on their employment to assert preferences about which days they wished to work, had very limited ability to claim a day of rest on their own authority. The religious justification and the labor protection argument were not the same argument. They arrived at this particular place by entirely different roads. But they arrived at the same place. Sunday off, which was, for a textile worker in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1850, not a philosophical luxury, but a genuine bodily necessity. The blue laws persisted in modified forms well into the 20th century and, in scattered remnants, into the 21st. Many Americans retain a memory of laws that restricted alcohol sales before noon on Sunday, or that required certain categories of business to operate under different hours on that day. Some states prohibited car sales on Sunday for decades, a restriction whose Protestant theological origins were rarely mentioned in the automobile dealership's parking lot, but were, nonetheless, embedded somewhere in the law's ancestry. In Pennsylvania, hunting restrictions on Sunday that trace a direct line back to colonial Sabbath prohibitions remained in place until relatively recently. What makes the blue laws historically interesting is how thoroughly they mix theological and practical purposes, until the two were almost inseparable. Were they about God, about workers, about the shared rhythm of community life that required some common quiet, about protecting small businesses from the competitive disadvantage of a competitor who worked the day they were closed? The honest answer is probably all of these, in different proportions for different people in different eras, in ways that make clean categorization impossible. By the late 20th century, most of the substantive blue laws had been gradually repealed through constitutional challenges and commercial lobbying that found its most effective arguments in the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Sunday is now, in most of America, commercially identical to Saturday. The malls are fully open. The grocery stores are busy. Whether anything was lost along with the silence is a question that different people answer differently. And perhaps the most honest thing to say is that the answer depends entirely on what kind of Sunday you had. But while the blue laws were protecting the day, something else was happening in the mail. Something that was, from one angle, a story about censorship and the extraordinary overreach of a deeply moralistic postal inspector who had been given rather more authority than was probably wise. And from another angle, a story about a mail system so completely unregulated that genuinely dangerous things were flowing through it with no legal mechanism to stop them. Imagine the main post office of a medium-sized American city in the autumn of 1873. The room smells of ink and paper and the particular dry warmth of coal stoves working steadily against the October chill. Clerks move between sorting shelves with the focused efficiency of people whose job requires accuracy at speed. Sacks of mail arrive from stagecoaches and rail cars and are upended onto tables and sorted by destination and class with practiced hands. The mail is everything in 1873. It is the national communications network, the commercial nervous system of the country. Newspapers travel by mail. Books travel by mail. Business correspondence, bank drafts, prescriptions from distant doctors, letters between separated families, political pamphlets, religious tracts, commercial catalogs of every description. All of it moves through the Postal Service, which handles it with an access and volume and geographic reach that no other institution can match. And into this system, flowing alongside the legitimate correspondence and the business letters and the religious tracts, is something considerably less benign. Fraudulent lottery schemes targeting people of modest means and taking what little they had, promising returns that the mathematics of the arrangement made impossible. Patent medicine catalogs advertising cures for cancer, tuberculosis, syphilis, and kidney failure, using preparations whose actual contents were not disclosed and whose therapeutic value was, at best, the comfort of believing you were doing something. Mail order operations selling devices and chemical preparations for abortion, sometimes to women in desperate circumstances, with no medical supervision and no reliable knowledge of what the preparation contained or what it might do to the person who used it. Material explicitly targeting young people with content designed to exploit their inexperience. The postal system of the early 1870s was, in its unregulated form, a frontier. And frontiers historically attract the same categories of people: the adventurous, the industrious, and those who had identified an opportunity in the gap between what was legal and what was harmful. Into this situation came Anthony Comstock. He was, in 1973, a 29-year-old dry goods clerk from Connecticut with moral conviction of a kind that tends to make everyone in the immediate vicinity slightly uncomfortable, and that tends, when combined with institutional authority, to produce outcomes that are both effective and excessive simultaneously. Comstock documented the problem with obsessive energy. He gathered evidence of the fraudulent medicine, the predatory material, the lottery schemes. He brought his documentation to Congress, which had been hearing reports about the mail for years without taking significant action. He showed them what was actually flowing through the postal system and argued that the federal government had both the authority and the obligation to stop it. Congress was persuaded. The Comstock Act, passed in March of 1873, made it a federal crime to send to the United States mail any material deemed obscene, lewd, or lascivious. It also prohibited mailing anything related to abortion or contraception, information about sexually transmitted diseases, and, in some interpretations, medical textbooks that included anatomical illustrations considered too frank for the Postal Service. From the vantage of the 21st century, the Comstock Act looks like a monument to a very particular kind of overreach, banning medical information from mail, treating educational material about contraception as legally equivalent to obscenity, allowing a single person's sense of the appropriate to determine what consenting adults could receive in the privacy of their homes. The law's reach extended to works of recognized literary value, to public health information that could have prevented the diseases it refused to discuss, and to medical education at a time when medical education in America was still finding its footing. The criticism is valid. It is also incomplete. The specific harms that Comstock had documented in the mail were real. The fraudulent patent medicines being sold to desperate people were real. The mail-order abortion preparations being sent without medical supervision, sometimes killing the women who used them, were real. The material exploiting young people was real. The postal system had no mechanism to distinguish between legitimate medical information and fraudulent claims about miracle cures, between sincere educational material and predatory exploitation of vulnerable people. Comstock identified a genuine problem and fashioned a tool of considerable power to address it. The tool was too broad, wielded with too little restraint, and grew to reach things it should never have touched. Its effects on birth control advocacy, on public health education, on literature, on the ability of women, in particular to access information about their own reproductive health, were genuinely damaging and lasted for decades. He was, in a formulation that seems to fit a great deal to history we are moving through tonight, a person who was right about the problem and seriously wrong about the scope of the solution. The Comstock Act was gradually gutted through a long series of court decisions, most significantly through Supreme Court rulings in the 1960s that substantially narrowed the legal definition of obscenity in ways that made most of Comstock's prosecutorial enthusiasm historically obsolete. The laws themselves remained in vestigial form on the federal books far longer than almost anyone realized. Meanwhile, on the docks of New York Harbor, a different kind of rule was waiting for the people who were arriving in America for the first time. They had crossed an ocean. They could see the statue. The crossing was almost over, and the rule that greeted them was written not in ink on federal paper, but in chalk, on their clothing, by a man with quick eyes and a very specific list of what he was looking for. The ship has been at sea for 12 days, or 16, or 23, depending on which port it departed from and what the Atlantic decided to do with the wind during the crossing. You are standing on the deck in the cold gray light of a New York morning, somewhere between 1892 and 1920, and your legs have not yet remembered what solid ground feels like. The person beside you smells of the crossing, salt and close quarters, and a particular staleness of air that has been breathed by hundreds of people in a space designed for somewhat fewer. You have been in that air long enough that you have stopped noticing it. But ahead is what you came for. The harbor is wider than you imagined from any description. The statue is larger, much larger than any words prepared you for, standing in the water with its torch raised against the morning sky in a gesture that carries, even now, even after weeks of crossing, something genuine, something that the letters from home and the stories of those who came before were trying to scribe and could not quite reach. And the island ahead, not the statue's island, the other one, just beyond it, with the red brick buildings and the people moving on it like distant figures. Ellis Island, the place where the crossing ends and the question begins. Between 1892 and 1954, approximately 12 million people passed through Ellis Island. They came from Italy and Poland and Russia and Hungary and Greece and Lithuania and dozens of other countries, often with nothing more than a bundle of belongings, a piece of paper with an address written on it by someone who had come before, and the accumulated hope of a decision that had taken years to make and everything they had to act on. The process that greeted them was, given the numbers involved, organized with a certain grim efficiency. The medical inspection happened in the registry room, at the top of the staircase, where doctors from the United States Public Health Service stood watching the arriving passengers file past. They were looking for specific things. A limp, a labored breath, the yellow tinge of jaundice at the corners of the eyes, the particular way a person moves when they are concealing pain, a child being carried when, by its apparent age, it should be walking on its own. If a doctor saw something that concerned him, he stepped forward and made a mark in chalk on the immigrant's clothing. The letters were a code. An H indicated the doctor wanted the heart examined more closely. AK meant the knees. AG marked a potential goiter. An X inside a circle indicated possible mental impairment for further evaluation. The marks were made quickly on the clothing of human beings who often had no idea what the letters meant, who watched the chalk touch their coats with expressions ranging from confusion to barely contain fear. About 80% of arrivals passed through without receiving any mark at all. Of those who received chalk marks, the majority were examined more thoroughly and clear to enter. About 2% of all arrivals at Ellis Island were ultimately turned away and returned to the country they came from. 2% sounds small. At Ellis Island's peak processing years, it represented thousands of people annually who would cross an ocean, seen the harbor, pass through the doors, and were told that America would not be admitting them. The health inspections were imperfect in ways that reflect both the medicine and the social assumptions of their time. Criteria for exclusion were inconsistently applied. Certain nationalities faced more intensive scrutiny than others, influenced by prejudices about which immigrant groups were desirable that had nothing to do with public health and everything to do with the anxieties of the receiving society. There were documented cases of people being excluded for conditions that did not actually impair their capacity to work or participate in community life. But the underlying public health concern was not invented. Tuberculosis was one of the leading causes of death in the United States in the 1890s, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. Cholera had swept through American cities in waves throughout the 19th century, arriving on ships and moving through tenement districts with a speed that the public health infrastructure at the time had almost no tools to interrupt. Trachoma, an infectious eye disease, caused progressive blindness if untreated, and there was no reliable cure. The country had no national health system capable of absorbing large numbers of people with active contagious diseases and providing adequate care. A ship arriving in New York Harbor in 1895 could be carrying, alongside the families with their bundles and their addresses and their hopes, a passenger with active pulmonary tuberculosis who had spent 3 weeks in close quarters with hundreds of other people. The mathematics of contagion in the tenement districts of Lower Manhattan, where many arriving immigrants settled initially, were not comfortable. The medical inspection was crude. The science behind it was incomplete by standards that came later. The system it supported was influenced by prejudices that no public health justification could fully cover. But the doctors standing at the top of the stairs were also, genuinely, trying to do something that the medicine of their time and society around them made it very difficult to do well. Prevent the movement of epidemic disease through a portal that was processing millions of people in an era before antibiotics, before reliable vaccines of major killers, before any of the tools that would eventually make the task manageable. The chalk marks were not decoration. They were the vocabulary of an overwhelmed system trying to function at the outer limit of what 19th century public health science actually understood. The torch on the harbor statue was lit at night in those years. Ships coming into the harbor after dark could see it from a long way out. It meant the crossing was almost over. On the other side of the island, in the city absorbing all those arrivals, a different kind of problem was coming to a head. Not about bodies crossing borders, but about money and about how much it was quietly moving, steadily and systematically, from the pockets of ordinary people and small businesses into the accounts of a very small number of men who had discovered that controlling an entire industry was considerably more profitable than competing in one. Picture a general store in a small Ohio town in 1888. The shelves smell of sawdust and lamp oil and the faint sweetness of dried goods. The light comes through 2 windows in a particular way that late afternoon light comes through dusty glass, picking out the floating particles above the counter, where you are having a conversation with a man who has run this store for more than 20 years and has tried to explain why his profit margin on kerosene has been shrinking for the past several years in ways he cannot entirely account for. The problem is not the kerosene itself. The kerosene is fine. The problem is the price of it. More specifically, the fact that the price of kerosene in this distribution territory, and in most distribution territories in the United States, is set by the Standard Oil Company, controlled by John D. Rockefeller, and the price is whatever Standard Oil decides it is, because Standard Oil controls enough of the American petroleum business that the concept of competitive pricing in kerosene is technically available but practically meaningless. The store owner is not wrong about this. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil controlled somewhere in the range of 90% of American oil refining capacity. That is not a rounding error. That is the kind of market position that makes competition a word with an unusual relationship to actual market conditions. Standard Oil had achieved this through a combination of genuine operational efficiency. Rockefeller was genuinely very good at running refineries, and a set of additional practices that were considerably more legally questionable. Secret railroad rebate arrangements allowed Standard Oil to ship petroleum products at rates lower than competitors could obtain, giving a cost advantage that had nothing to do with operational efficiency and everything to do with the private arrangements its lawyers had negotiated. Aggressive predatory pricing in local markets. Cutting prices below cost to drive independent competitors out of business, then raising prices again once the competition was gone, was a documented pattern. The trust structure, perfected in the early 1880s, allowed formally separate companies to coordinate their activities under a central board in ways that eliminated competition between them while maintaining the legal fiction that they were independent entities. Standard Oil was not the only trust operating on this model. Trusts had developed in sugar, in steel, in whiskey, in tobacco, in matches, in almost every major industrial category of the era. The common effect on prices was consistent. When competition in an industry was effectively eliminated, prices in that industry were set by the dominant entity rather than by the market, and set at levels that extracted maximum value from buyers who had no practical alternative. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890, prohibiting every contract combination or conspiracy in restraint of trade. The law was notable for its ambition and somewhat remarkable in its vagueness. Language broad enough to technically implicate most normal business arrangements and simultaneously imprecise enough that nobody was entirely sure what, in practice, triggered it. For the first decade of its existence, the law was not energetically enforced. The federal government of the 1890s had limited appetite for prosecuting the major industrial trusts whose wealth was also the wealth of the party's most significant financial supporters. The Sherman Act sat on the books as a statement of principle more than an active tool of economic policy. Then Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901. Roosevelt was not a man who found ambiguity troubling. When he had decided what was right, he directed his attorney general to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company controlled by J.P. Morgan, the largest and most powerful banker in the United States. Morgan reportedly came to the White House in person to discuss the matter, apparently approaching the President of the United States the way one might approach a business rival, who had made an impolite opening move in a negotiation. Roosevelt was not interested in a negotiation. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the government in 1904. Northern Securities was dissolved. The Standard Oil case took longer. The government filed suit in 1906. The Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil in 1911 and ordered it dissolved into 34 separate companies. Some of those companies, through subsequent mergers and corporate evolutions, eventually became Exxon, Mobil, and Chevron, which are, in their current form, large enough that John D. Rockefeller might find them recognizable as relatives. The Sherman Act was a blunt instrument applied to a real and complex problem. That concentrated economic power in the hands of very few entities was genuinely distorting markets, genuinely harming small businesses, and genuinely extracting money from ordinary consumers without offering them any mechanism of recourse was documentably true. The store owner paying Rockefeller's kerosene price was not imagining a problem. The law's vagueness required subsequent refinement. The Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act of 1914 attempted to draw the lines between legitimate business cooperation and illegal combination with more precision. What remained was a principle that economic power, like political power, becomes dangerous when it concentrates too completely, that markets needed some mechanism, imperfect, debated, subject to constant revision, to prevent single entities from achieving control sufficient to make the word competition ceremonially rather than practically meaningful. The kerosene in the Ohio store is still being sold at Rockefeller's price. For now, but across town, in the pharmacy on the corner, a different kind of problem is waiting in amber bottles on well-lit shelves, with labels making promises that the contents cannot keep, sold to people who have no way of knowing what is actually inside what they're buying and trusting. Walk into an American pharmacy in 1905. The smell is a layered sweetness, sugar syrup over something sharper, medicinal. The combined odor of dozens of preparations arranged on shelves with names printed in confident, authoritative typography that implies a certainty the contents cannot always support. The pharmacist behind the counter is a professional. He knows his trade. The preparations he sells were manufactured by companies that have been operating for decades, whose products have loyal customers, whose advertisements appear in newspapers nationwide. The problem is not the pharmacist. The problem is that many of the things he is selling were produced under no regulatory standard whatsoever, were never tested for safety or efficacy in any meaningful sense, and contain ingredients that the label does not mention, and that the buyer has no reliable way of discovering independently. The bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, marketed specifically for infants and young children experiencing the distress of teething, contains morphine and alcohol. The advertisement does not say this. The label does not say this. What the label says is that it soothes, that it calms, that it is safe for little ones. And it does soothe. The morphine is quite effective at producing stillness in a distressed infant. The long-term effects on the nervous systems of children who received it regularly were not what the parents selecting it from the pharmacy shelf were hoping for, and the parents had no particular way of knowing those effects were occurring. Hostetler stomach bitters, sold for digestive complaints of every description, is approximately 44% alcohol, stronger than most wine, comparable to many whiskeys. It is sold in states with active temperance laws as a medicine, because of medicine classification exempted from the alcohol restrictions that apply to beverages. The manufacturers identified this legal gap with considerable commercial enthusiasm. The patent medicine industry of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was enormous. It was profitable. It was loosely regulated and in many cases actively harmful to the people buying it on the basis of claims that existed in a legal environment where claiming something was sufficient to make it sellable. Then Upton Sinclair published a book in January of 1906 that he intended as a cry for the rights of immigrant workers, and that the American public received primarily as a very alarming report about what was happening to their meat. Sinclair had spent weeks inside the meatpacking plants of Chicago gathering material for a novel about the exploitation of immigrant labor in the stockyards. He wrote about the grinding poverty of the workers, the dangerous conditions, the wages that couldn't cover basic necessities. He wanted, as he said later, to strike the public's heart. Instead, he struck it firmly in the stomach. The passages people remembered were the ones about the meat. Spoiled beef treated with chemicals to neutralize the smell. Product that had fallen on contaminated floors, swept back into the processing line. The rendering rooms where the materials that could not be sold as meat became the materials that could be sold as something else. Sinclair described these things in terms that reportedly caused several members of Congress to push their lunch away from them while the relevant passages were being read aloud. Theodore Roosevelt, who was not easily rattled by much but who had been receiving reports from Harvey Wiley, the chief chemist at the Department of Agriculture, for some time about the state of American food and drug manufacturing, arranged to have independent investigators confirm what Sinclair had described. The investigators confirmed it. Harvey Wiley had spent years documenting food adulteration. Formaldehyde was being added to milk to slow spoilage during warm weather. Copper sulfate was being used to make canned peas retain a bright green color that the natural canning process destroyed, because consumers expected green peas to be bright green, and the sulfate delivered the appearance without the substance. Coal tar dyes were coloring candies and beverages. Ground spices were being extended with sawdust. Whiskey was being diluted and sold as a genuine article. Boric acid, which had measurable effects on kidney function, was being used as preservative in butter and canned goods. Wiley organized what the press called the Poison Squad, a group of young volunteers from the Department of Agriculture who agreed to eat carefully prepared meals containing specified quantities of suspected harmful additives, and to keep detailed health diaries documenting the effects. The squad ate borax in their food. They consumed formaldehyde. They ingested copper sulfate. The experience was, by most accounts, not pleasant, and the health records they kept confirmed that the additives being used commercially were producing measurable harm in the people who consumed them. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, both signed in June of 1906, require that food and drug products in interstate commerce be accurately labeled, that they not contain harmful adulterants, that meat be federally inspected before processing. The laws were not everything Wiley thought they should be. The food industry's lobbying had weakened several provisions, but they established for the first time that the federal government had a legitimate role in ensuring that American food and medicine were what their labels claimed. This sounds self-evident from the 21st century. Of course food should be accurately labeled. Of course medicine should not contain unlabeled narcotics. But in 1906, These were not self-evident propositions. They were contested ones, argued against on the grounds that they constituted an unacceptable federal intrusion into private commercial activity, and that the market, if left alone, would sort these things out through consumer choice. The market had sorted things out. In the sense that the market always sorts things out, it had produced a profitable industry in inaccurately labeled, sometimes dangerous products that people bought because they had no better information and no legal requirement that better information be provided to them. The FDA, as it exists today, was decades of additional legislation away from a 1906 Act. But the 1906 Act was the foundation. The moment the American government officially committed to the proposition that what Americans ate and drank and put in their bodies was a matter of legitimate public concern rather than an entirely private commercial transaction. The soothing syrup is still on the shelf. The pharmacist has no obligation yet to change the label, but the direction of the next 100 years is visible from here if you know where to look. And in the factories and mills beyond the pharmacy window, a different kind of damage is accumulating in a different kind of body. The damage that comes from starting work before your bones are finished growing. In rooms that smell of coal dust and machine oil, before the sun has fully risen over the mill district rooftops. It is 5:30 in the morning. The air in the mill district has a particular quality of industrial early morning. Coal smoke already rising from the boilers, the smell of machine oil carried on a cold wind, the sound of the mill itself beginning to reach its operational roar somewhere ahead. The sky is lightening at the eastern edge, but it is not daylight yet. The people moving toward the mill entrance include adults and, among them, considerably smaller figures. Children. Some are 8 years old. Some are 9 or 10. Some are younger than their employment paperwork suggests, because the paperwork was completed by parents who needed the income and mill managers who needed the labor, and these two needs found a certain practical accommodation in the column's recording age. They are going to work a shift of 10 to 12 hours, in a room where cotton dust floats with a density that settles, over years, in the lungs in ways that workers who survived their 30s will understand too clearly. The machinery moves at a speed that requires constant attention, and the 6th hour of a long shift is the hour when attention is most difficult to maintain. Small hands that drift near moving parts at the wrong moment encounter consequences that are immediate and permanent. Lewis Hine, a sociologist who worked for the National Child Labor Committee in the first decade of the 20th century, spent years traveling to mills and mines and canneries with a camera documenting what was there. His photographs showed children in coal mines called breaker boys, sorted coal from slate for hours at a time, bent over chutes in the dark, picking out rock by hand. Children in glass factories called carrying in boys, moving hot glass on iron rods through temperatures that the adult workers in the same room also found challenging. Children in textile mills called doffers, whose job was to change bobbins on spinning machines, which meant moving around the machinery while it operated at full speed and reaching into it to complete the task. The photographs are quiet in the way that powerful documentation is often quiet. They present the evidence, and then they simply wait while you look at it. The reason child labor existed was not mysterious. Families needed the income. A child's wage, small as it was by adult standards, could be the difference between sufficient and insufficient in a household where the adult wages were already not quite covering what the household required. The mill owners preferred child labor partly for the lower wage rate, and partly because some specific tasks, the small spaces in coal mines, the quick hands on the bobbins, were genuinely suited to smaller bodies. The first federal attempt to restrict child labor, the Keating-Owen Child Labor Act of 1916, was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1918. The court ruled that Congress lacked authority under the Commerce Clause to regulate the conditions under which goods were manufactured, only the movement of those goods between states. The distinction was technical. The effect was to place the regulation of child labor back with the individual states, several of which had industries with a significant investment in the existing arrangement. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 finally established federal ground rules. Children under 16 could not be employed in manufacturing or mining. Children under 18 could not work in occupations designated hazardous. Working hours for children under 16 were restricted during school hours. The argument made against these laws, and it was made consistently by people who were not simply cynical about children, was that they interfered with families' economic decisions, that they would deprive poor families of needed income, that the market would eventually address the problem as it became economically inefficient to employ children. Lewis Hines' photographs are a kind of answer, not an analytical one, just the evidence that the market, unregulated, had arrived at this particular arrangement and found it workable. The children in the photographs look directly at the camera with a composure that is harder to look at than distress would be. They are not performing suffering. They simply occupy the situation they are in with the settled stillness of people who have no particular expectation that it will be different. The morning shift is beginning. The looms are coming up to full speed. And somewhere outside on the eastern horizon, something is happening to the time itself. Because the government has decided that the sun is occurring at the wrong hour, and that something can be done about this. You are waking up at what your body understands to be 6 in the morning. The light outside the window has the exact quality and angle of 6 o'clock light. Your internal clock, shaped by a lifetime of mornings at regular intervals, is confident about this. Your bedside clock says 7. This is not a malfunction. The government has adjusted the clocks. Welcome to daylight saving time. The idea of shifting clocks seasonally to make better use of available daylight had been proposed in various forms during the 19th century, most charmingly by a New Zealand entomologist named George Hudson, who wanted more evening hours to collect insects, which is perhaps not the founding story you would choose if you were designing the mythology of policy that affects hundreds of millions of people. The idea was developed more seriously by William Willett, an English building contractor who wrote a pamphlet in 1907 called The Waste of Daylight, observing that people were sleeping through useful morning hours while their clocks told them it was still very early. Germany and Austria became the first countries to formally implement the shift in April of 1916. The reason was entirely practical and entirely wartime. Coal, artificial lighting required fuel, and fuel was needed for the war effort. If work and leisure activities could be shifted to take advantage of natural daylight in the evening hours, less coal would be burned for artificial light, and that coal could go toward the machinery of the war instead. The United States adopted daylight saving time to the Standard Time Act of 1918, signed specifically as a war measure. The same logic applied. Move the clock, save fuel, redirect the savings toward the war. The nation would collectively agree that morning was now 1 hour later, and the evening would correspondingly have 1 more hour of natural light. The American farming community responded with what might charitably be described as organized displeasure. The problem was a fundamental incompatibility between the clock and biology. Cows are milked at intervals that their bodies maintain with considerable precision, and their bodies do not receive or acknowledge communications from the federal government. The cow that was ready to be milked at what its internal schedule understood to be 6 in the morning was still ready to be milked at 6 regardless of what the clock said. The farmer who tried to begin the morning routine an hour earlier by clock time was attempting to milk animals that were not ready to be milked. The farmer who kept to the animal schedule was now operating an hour behind the new clock, which created cascading problems with rail schedules, market hours, and everything else that had reorganized itself around the new time. The unpopularity of daylight saving time in agricultural communities was substantial and immediate. Congress repealed it in 1919, just 7 months after the war that had justified it ended. Woodrow Wilson, who had a particular personal fondness for the system, he enjoyed the longer golf evenings it produced, vetoed the repeal. Congress overrode the veto by a wide margin. The clocks went back to following the sun. What followed was several decades of American timekeeping in a condition of fragmented local independence that made scheduling any activity crossing state or county lines a minor logistical challenge. Cities adopted their own daylight saving arrangements. Counties adjacent to those cities did not. The state of Indiana at one point had counties simultaneously observing 4 different local time practices, which must have made the state's railway schedules a document of considerable philosophical ambiguity. Daylight saving time returned federally during the Second World War, under the name wartime, observed year-round. After the war, it evaporated again into local discretion. The Uniform Time Act of 1966 finally standardized the dates on which the transition occurred nationally, while leaving individual states the option to exempt themselves entirely. Arizona opted out, on the grounds that adding more daylight hours to Arizona summers was a solution to a problem that Arizona did not experience as a problem. Hawaii opted out. Indiana's situation remained complicated until 2006. The energy savings argument, which was the original justification, is real but modest in the modern era. The economic arguments of the additional evening daylight hours, tourism, retail, outdoor recreation are real. The health effects of the twice-yearly disruption to sleep schedules have become better documented, with measurable spikes in cardiovascular events and workplace accidents in the days immediately following the spring change. The original reason has been gone for over a century. The system remains because changing it requires a level of coordinated agreement that has, so far, proven elusive. The clock says 7. Your body says 6. The cows are waiting for no one's opinion on the matter. But the clock argument was a quiet one, because while the hours of the day were being debated in Congress, something considerably larger was building on the streets and in the homes of American cities. A movement that had been growing for decades, fueled by evidence that was genuinely difficult to argue with, was about to become, in January of 1920, the law of the entire land. And it was about to discover that becoming the law and being followed were two rather different propositions. It is a Friday evening in a working-class neighborhood of an American city. The year is 1919, and the saloon on the corner has stood here longer than most of the buildings that surround it. The windows are warm and amber in the fading afternoon light. The doors are open, and the sound coming out is a particular sound of a place where the working week ends. Conversation at several volumes simultaneously, the clink of glasses, the particular acoustic warmth of a room full of people who are standing close together because the room is full. Inside, the light is close and steady. The bar is wood polished by 2 decades of elbows. The smell is beer and sawdust and tobacco smoke, and the specific human warmth of a room occupied by people who have been working since before the sun was fully up. The saloon is a social institution for the men who drink here, and it is mostly men. It is the place where the week's particular pressure goes, where you stand next to your neighbor and your co-worker and speak about something other than the machinery and the foreman and the piece rate. In January of 1920, this saloon will close. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in January of 1919, prohibits the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating beverages in the United States. The Volstead Act, passed to enforce it, has defined what counts as intoxicating and has set the penalties for violations. The saloon on the corner has become, overnight, illegal. Prohibition is the most famous example in American history, a well-intentioned law producing spectacular unintended consequences. The speakeasies, the organized crime, the corrupted police, the bathtub gin. It is remembered now primarily as a monument to the naivety of believing that you can change a deeply ingrained social behavior through the force of federal prohibition alone. And yet the reason prohibition came to exist is, if you look at it carefully, considerably less ridiculous than the law's reputation suggests. Alcohol consumption in the United States in the 1830s was approximately 3 times higher per person than it is today. This is not an anti-temperance talking point. It is what the historical records show. Per capita consumption of pure alcohol was estimated at around 7 gallons per year. The figure today is roughly 2.5 gallons. Early 19th century America was, in terms of how much its adult population was drinking, dramatically different from any period that followed. The context was industrial. The work was dangerous. Factories had no safety regulations. Workers' compensation did not exist. A man who arrived at his shift unsteady from the previous evening's drinking, or who was working to the physical aftermath of a heavy week of drinking, was at genuine risk of injury or death, and the factory treated that injury as his own problem. The machinery was indifferent to impairment. The household was not. The legal protections available to women whose husbands spent the household wage in saloons and returned home violent were, in the 1880s and 90s, minimal to non-existent. Domestic violence had no specific criminal category. A wife's testimony against her husband was inadmissible in many jurisdictions. The saloon, which extended credit to regulars and was designed to keep men spending as long as they remained capable of spending, was not a neutral institution from the perspective of the families waiting at home. The temperance movement was, in substantial part, a women's rights movement. Not because women were inherently hostile to alcohol or naturally more moralistic than men. Because the documented consequences of widespread, heavy alcohol use in the industrial era fell disproportionately on women and children who had very limited legal recourse. The Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League built their political cases on statistics, domestic violence rates, poverty rates, industrial accident records that were not invented for the argument. The suffering those statistics represented was real. Prohibition, when it took effect, worked in some of the ways it was intended to. Alcohol consumption did fall, substantially at first, and measurably throughout the Prohibition era. Deaths from cirrhosis of the liver dropped dramatically in the first years after the law took effect. Hospital admissions for alcohol-related conditions declined. The specific social harms that the temperance movement had spent decades documenting did, in fact, decrease. What Prohibition had not adequately accounted for was the American appetite for alcohol, which turned out to be resilient in the face of constitutional amendment. The organizational capacity of criminal enterprises that quickly identified a vast new market, and particular corrosive effect that routinely ignored laws have on the general social respect for law. The speakeasies that replaced the saloons were estimated to outnumber them in major cities. The bootlegging trade enriched organized crime in ways that transformed the structure and reach of criminal enterprise in America for decades. The corruption of police departments and municipal governments that accompanied Prohibition, the payments, the arrangements, the systemic looking away, damaged the institutional trust that law enforcement depends on. Prohibition was repealed by the 21st Amendment in December of 1933, 13 years after it took effect. The saloon on the corner eventually reopened under different management, with a new sign above the door. The temperance movement's diagnosis was not wrong. The level of alcohol-related harm in industrial America was a genuine public health crisis by any honest measure. The question was whether federal prohibition was the right treatment for it, and the answer that 1933 delivered was not as implemented, without the support systems and enforcement infrastructure and social alternatives that might have made the difference. The problem was real. The solution was imperfect in ways that created serious problems of its own. This does not make the people who fought for prohibition simply stupid or simply cruel. It makes them people who were trying, with limited tools and incomplete information, to address something that was genuinely hurting people they cared about. Outside the former saloon, the street is filling with cars. The automobile has arrived in American cities over the past decade with a speed and volume that nobody was fully prepared for. And the people walking on the street, people who have been walking on streets their whole lives, for whom the street is simply the ground between buildings, are about to discover that the law has some thoughts about where exactly they are allowed to walk on it. The street in front of you in 1922, in any American city of moderate size, is a complicated and contested space being contested in real time. It is a space for horses and wagons, though fewer of those than there were 10 years ago. The horse is in active retreat before the automobile, visibly losing ground year by year. It is a space for electric streetcars on fixed rails. It is a space for bicycles and push carts and hand trucks and the full variety of human-powered transportation that a city generates. And it is, above all, a space for people. People crossing where they find a gap. People stopping to talk to a neighbor at the edge of the road. People walking along the side of the roadway because the sidewalk is crowded or because where they're going is simply across the street. Into this complicated human space has arrived the automobile, and the automobile is having genuine difficulty adapting to the existing arrangement. Before cars, deaths on American city streets were not common. Horses ran people down sometimes. Loading accidents occurred, but the street as a physical environment operated at speeds that were, on the whole, compatible with human reaction time. People could generally see what was coming and respond to it. The automobile changed this calculation rapidly. By 1925, automobile accidents were killing approximately 15,000 Americans per year. A large proportion of those deaths were pedestrians. People who had used streets their entire lives with reasonable safety and who were now sharing that space with machines moving at speeds that offered significantly less margin for error. The word jaywalking entered American vocabulary in this period. A jay was early 20th century slang for a country person, a rustic and unsophisticated individual unfamiliar with city ways. Jaywalking, in its original usage, meant walking in a city street the way a country person would, without understanding how urban traffic worked. What is less frequently mentioned in the standard history is that the term was actively promoted by automobile industry associations and car manufacturers as part of a campaign to redefine the social and legal character of the street. Before these campaigns, the person who caused an accident by hitting a pedestrian in the street was generally understood to be the driver, who had brought a dangerous machine into a public space and was therefore responsible for operating it safely within that space. The pedestrian was where pedestrians had always been, in the street. After the campaigns of the early 1920s, the framing began to shift. The street was being redefined as a space primarily for vehicles. The pedestrian who crossed outside a designated crossing was now characterized as the intruder, the jay, misusing space that properly belonged to traffic. Cities began passing jaywalking ordinances requiring pedestrians to cross at designated intersections, to wait for traffic signals, to use the crosswalk infrastructure that the new street design was providing. Crossing mid-block became an infraction. Police could ticket people for walking in the street in the way people had always walked in streets. The traffic safety argument for these laws was genuine. Crossing at intersections, where drivers expected pedestrians and where traffic controls created some order, was measurably safer than crossing at unpredictable mid-block points. The laws did reduce pedestrian deaths when consistently enforced, but the laws also accomplished something less often named. They moved the legal responsibility for pedestrian safety from the person operating the dangerous machine in the shared public space to the person simply walking. The automobile was legally granted priority status in a space that had, for the entire history of cities, been organized around the needs of human beings on foot. The pedestrian was required to accommodate the car's presence rather than the other way around. The effects on urban design lasted for the rest of the century. Cities rebuilt themselves around automobile flow. Parking requirements consumed land that might have been parks or buildings. The pedestrian signal became the permission system through which people were allowed to momentarily reclaim sections of road that had been legally established as primarily vehicular space. Jaywalking laws remain in effect across most of the United States, though enforcement has always varied enormously between jurisdictions. Some cities have effectively stopped enforcing them. Others continue to issue citations. The deaths they were designed to prevent were real. The method of prevention, legally subordinating the person on foot to the machine, reflected assumptions about streets and cities and the hierarchy of users that were established in the 1920s and have proved remarkably difficult to revise, even as the arguments for revising them have accumulated steadily. The city is reorganizing itself around the car, and in the buildings along these reorganized streets, in the offices of the federal agencies that had expanded dramatically through the difficult years of the Depression, a different kind of problem was taking shape. Not about what was happening in the streets, but about what was happening in the offices. Specifically, about what the people who worked in those offices were being quietly asked to do with their evenings. It is the spring of 1938. You work in a federal agency, one of the many that the New Deal programs of the past several years have created or expanded significantly. The work is steady government work, organized and paper-filled, part of the enormous administrative apparatus that the Depression-era government built to manage its relief and recovery programs. Your supervisor has come to you with a request that is presented as casual, but has a particular quality beneath the casualness. There is an election approaching. The local Democratic organization needs volunteers for canvassing work. Given that you are employed by a federal program whose existence was created by Democratic legislation, it would be, the supervisor explains with friendliness at his edges, appreciate it if you could give some of your evenings to the effort. The request is not formally coercive. Nobody is explicitly threatening your job. But you work in a federal office in which the connection between political support and employment security is understood by everyone at the table, including you. The people who helped last time kept their jobs. The people who didn't work harder to remember the names of. Senator Carl Hatch in New Mexico had been watching this arrangement develop for several years before he brought it to the Senate floor. The New Deal had created an enormous federal workforce. At its peak, the Works Progress Administration alone employed millions of people. These were real jobs, doing real work. But the workers holding those jobs were, in varying degrees of explicitness depending on the state and the agency and the supervisor, being expected to participate in partisan political activities on behalf of the party, whose programs employed them. The arrangement had a logic from the inside that was difficult to argue against on purely practical grounds. Of course, workers and programs created by a particular party would be supportive of that party's continuation in office. Of course, their supervisors, who were political appointees of that party, would find it natural to encourage that support through the organizational structures available to them. The problem was systemic. Federal employees were becoming, in practice, an arm of the governing party's political apparatus. The line between the government as a governing institution and the party as an electoral organization was blurring in ways that undermined both. Voters were employed in federal programs and simultaneously expected to vote and campaign for the party running those programs. The civil service, which was supposed to be a professional structure that provided continuity and expertise regardless of which party held the executive branch, was being converted into a partisan operation. The Hatch Act of 1939, formally titled the Act to Prevent Pernicious Political Activities, prohibited federal employees from engaging in partisan political activities. They retained the right to vote, to hold personal political opinions, and to express those opinions privately. What they could not do was campaign for candidates, solicit political contributions on behalf of a party, run for partisan office, or be coerced into political participation as a condition of their employment. The objection to the Hatch Act, which was genuine and philosophically serious, was that it restricted the civil rights of federal employees as citizens. Citizens in a democracy have the right to political participation. Why should accepting a government job mean surrendering that participation? The answer was in the coercion problem, not in what employees might choose to do freely, but in what they were being organized to do under pressure from the institutional structures above them. The Hatch Act protected federal workers from that pressure. It also protected the idea of the civil service itself, a professional administrative structure that provided expertise, continuity, and institutional knowledge regardless of which party held power, and whose employees' job security depended on doing the work well rather than on supporting the right candidate. The argument that a genuinely neutral civil service is an ideal rather than an achievable reality is not entirely wrong. But the alternative, a federal workforce systematically organized as a partisan political machine by whoever held the executive branch, had also been tried, and the result of trial had motivated a senator from New Mexico to spend considerable effort drafting a law that bears his name. The spring of 1938 is turning to summer. The federal offices are quiet. Decades will pass. The country will change in many ways. And then, on an October evening in 1973, something will happen in the Middle East that will eventually find its way to a number painted on the side of a highway sign, and to the experience of driving across Montana at night and finding, unexpectedly, that the law has opinions about your speed. The highway ahead is dark and entirely empty. The headlights pick out the white center line and the pale shoulder, and on either side, nothing much. The flat expanse of the Great Plains state you are crossing at 11 at night in the autumn of 1973. The road was engineered for high-speed travel across open terrain. The car is doing 80, 85 miles an hour, and the engine sounds comfortable at that speed, and the road is empty enough that comfortable and safe are approximately the same thing at this particular moment. The radio news from the past several weeks has been about something in the Middle East, an oil embargo. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries had announced in October of 1973 that it would not sell oil to the United States in retaliation for American military support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. The effects were immediate and visible. Gasoline prices had spiked in ways that people noticed at the pump every time they filled the tank. Lines at gas stations in some cities were wrapping around the block. Odd even rationing. You could buy gasoline only on certain days based on your license plate number, was being considered in several states. The Nixon administration needed responses that were visible, quick, and national in scale. In January of 1974, the president signed the Emergency Highway Energy Conservation Act, which established a national maximum speed limit of 55 miles per hour on every highway in the country. Regardless of the posted limit or what the road was designed for, the maximum legal speed was now 55 miles per hour. The fuel efficiency argument was real and was based on physics that the engineering community had documented. Aerodynamic drag on a vehicle increases as the square of its speed. The faster you go, the disproportionately more fuel you burn. At 55 miles per hour, most vehicles were operating in a range of relative fuel efficiency. Above 65 or 70, fuel consumption increased substantially. Studies conducted before and after the law estimated that it reduced national fuel consumption by several percentage points, which at the scale of American automobile use represented a meaningful quantity of gasoline. What the law's designers had not specifically anticipated was the effect on traffic fatalities. In the year following the implementation of the 55-mile-per-hour limit, traffic deaths on American highways fell substantially. The National Safety Council attributed a significant portion of the reduction to the speed limit. Slower speeds reduced the energy involved in crashes. They gave drivers additional reaction time. They meant that a mistake on the road was somewhat more survivable than the same mistake at 80. The problem was not the law's effects. The problem was the experience of driving across Montana. Montana is a large state. It is a state in which the distances between cities are measured in hours rather than minutes, in which the highways are wide and straight, and largely empty for stretches of miles, and in which the local understanding of appropriate driving speed had developed in response to actual conditions rather than to a federal energy policy written in an office in Washington. A 55-mile-per-hour limit in Montana was experienced not primarily as a safety measure, but as an imposition by the federal government on people who were perfectly capable of assessing the conditions of the road they were driving on. Montana's response to this was to set the fine for exceeding 55 miles per hour at $5, the minimum that state law allowed, and to instruct its highway patrol to enforce the limit with corresponding enthusiasm, which is to say with very little. The $5 fine was known colloquially as a wasting of daylight citation. It was less a legal deterrent than a statement of position. The federal government maintained leverage through highway funding. States that did not comply with the speed limit lost a percentage of their federal highway money. Most states complied on paper. Actual compliance on western highways, where the cultural and geographical objections were strongest, was uneven at best. The energy crisis that motivated the law eased. The gasoline line shortened. The oil embargo ended. The immediate justification for 55 miles per hour faded. But the traffic safety data continued to accumulate, and the law found offenders who argued on safety grounds even after the energy emergency that had created it was years in the past. The argument had shifted from crisis management to public health, which made it more durable and also more philosophically contested. The national maximum speed limit was finally repealed in December of 1995, returning speed limit authority to individual states. Speed limits on some western interstates are now posted as high as 80 or 85 miles per hour. The traffic fatality picture on those roads is complicated by decades of improvements in vehicle safety technology, changes in road design, and many other variables that make a simple before and after comparison difficult. What remains is the shape of the argument. A federal government looking at a national emergency and reaching for a tool that was available, visible, and immediate. A tool that turned out to work in ways its designers expected, and also in ways they didn't. A tool that generated resentment in proportion to how far the local conditions differed from the conditions the law was designed for. The highway is quieter now in the 1995 sense, with the speed limit signs reading higher numbers and the traffic moving accordingly. And ahead, on a road like this one, a different vehicle is traveling at a different kind of speed, exposed to the air, to the road, to the particular vulnerability of a human being moving fast without the shell of a car around them. And the question of whether the law had any business telling that rider what to wear on their head had been argued energetically for 3 decades. The road is a 2-lane state route in full summer, lined with trees approaching their late August density. The motorcycle beneath you is doing something that motorcycles do on roads like this that cars do not, moving through the air in a way that feels intimate with the landscape rather than insulated from it. The temperature changes slightly as you ride through a patch of shade from the tree canopy overhead. The road surface communicates its texture through the handlebars. The curve ahead is legible at the speed and angle in a way that is different from experiencing the same curve inside a car. This is what motorcycle riders describe when they try to explain the appeal, the unmediated quality of it, the absence of glass and steel between you and the road. The experience of speed is something felt rather than merely indicated by a gauge. The helmet sitting in your bag is an intrusion on this experience. It limits peripheral vision somewhat. It reduces the sound of the wind. It is heavier than not wearing one. It is, in a modest but real sense, a barrier between you and the thing you came here for. In the 1960s, the federal government began looking at motorcycle fatality statistics with an attention that the numbers warranted. Riders without helmets who experienced crashes at typical road speeds were dying and surviving with traumatic brain injuries at rates substantially higher than helmeted riders in comparable crashes. The physics were not complicated. The human skull is not designed to absorb the kinetic energy of contact with pavement at speed, and a properly engineered helmet substantially reduces that energy transfer. The Highway Safety Act of 1966 authorized the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to condition federal highway funding on states adopting specific safety measures, of which motorcycle helmet laws were among the most significant. The funding leverage worked with considerable efficiency. By 1975, 47 states had enacted mandatory helmet laws. The arguments against the laws were philosophically specific. The statistics were not the primary point of contention. The statistics were clear enough. The argument was about the nature of individual freedom and the proper scope of state authority over personal choices that primarily affected the person making them. John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that the only legitimate ground for restricting individual freedom is preventing harm to others, was the philosophical foundation of the objection. Not wearing a helmet injured nobody, but the rider who chose not to wear one. Therefore, the state had no legitimate authority to require it. This argument has a clean internal logic. It also collides with fact about modern societies that its 19th century philosophical foundations did not fully anticipate. That serious medical emergencies are not, in practice, borne entirely by the individuals who experience them. Traumatic brain injury is among the most expensive categories of medical treatment. Extended intensive care, rehabilitation for those who survive with permanent impairment, long-term care. These costs flow through public hospitals, through Medicaid, through the healthcare system broadly. The person who chose not to wear a helmet was making a decision whose financial consequences were distributed across the public in ways that complicated a purely individual liberty framing. Congress removed the federal leverage over helmet laws in 1976. The funding condition was stripped. Within a few years, half the states that had passed helmet laws under federal pressure had repealed them. The states that retained their laws continued to show measurably lower motorcycle fatality rates per registered motorcycle than the states that repealed them. This was documented, published, widely available, and did not resolve the political argument. The philosophical tension between personal choice and public cost does not have a clean resolution in motorcycle helmet statistics or in any other single policy domain. It is a tension that runs through American political culture in multiple forms across multiple issues, and that different people resolve in different directions, often based less on the specific statistics than on prior commitments about the proper relationship between individuals and the state. The road continues. The trees give way to open farmland. And somewhere ahead, visible through the windshield of a car rather than the open air of a motorcycle, is a different piece of hardware. A buckle and a strap that had been sitting in American cars for a quarter century before the law required anyone to use it, and a country in the process of discovering that knowing something saves lives and actually doing that thing are separated by a wider gap than anyone had quite expected. The car is a late model American sedan in the summer of 1983, and you are getting into the driver's side with the ease of someone who has gotten into this particular car approximately 1,000 times. The door closes with its familiar sound. The seat is warm from the sun. You adjust the mirror by reflex, turn the key, and the engine starts. The seatbelt is right there. The buckle is clipped to the door pillar at shoulder height. The strap hangs in its retractor, available, accessible, inches from your right hand. It has been in this car since the car was built, and in every car before for the past 2.5 decades. You are probably not going to put it on. In 1983, somewhere between 11 and 14% of American drivers wore their seatbelts consistently. This was a finding of research conducted around that time, and it was a number that illustrated a gap between what was known and what people were doing that had been open for about 25 years. The 3-point seatbelt, the diagonal plus lap belt that you still use today, was developed by Niels Bohlin at Volvo and introduced in 1959. Volvo then made the decision, remarkable in the context of automobile industry competitive behavior, to release the patent as a free public license rather than keeping it proprietary. Their calculation was that this safety technology was too important to be delayed by licensing negotiations. Other manufacturers could use it immediately and without cost. Most did, and by the late 1960s, the three-point belt was standard equipment in new American cars. Americans were not wearing it. The automobile death toll at this time was approximately 50,000 people per year in the United States. This number had been hovering in approximately this range for years, moving somewhat in response to economic conditions and gasoline prices and other factors, but remaining at a scale that, had it been produced by a disease or a natural disaster rather than the daily accumulation of traffic crashes, would have been classified as a national emergency and treated accordingly. Ralph Nader's book Unsafe at Any Speed, published in 1965, had made the case that automobile safety was not primarily a question of individual driver responsibility, but of engineering decisions, that the industry had known how to make safer cars and had chosen not to, partly because acknowledging safety as a design priority implied acknowledging that the current cars were in some respects dangerous. The seatbelt reduced the likelihood of death in a crash by approximately 45%. This had been established by research that the automobile industry and the insurance industry and the government had all reviewed. It was not disputed. It was simply not being translated into behavior at a scale that made a measurable difference in the death toll. The reasons people gave for not wearing seatbelts were various and recognizable. The belt was uncomfortable. It felt constraining. The trip was short. They were careful drivers. Accidents happened to other people, less careful people, people who had not been driving as long or as attentively. The optimism that most people extend to their own competence and their own luck was doing what optimism does. And the belt was staying unclipped. New York became the first state to require seatbelt use in December of 1984, with the law taking effect in January of 1985. Other states follow with varying speed and under varying degrees of federal encouragement, applied to the same mechanism of highway funding incentives that had been used for motorcycle helmets and speed limits. The arguments against a requirement were the familiar ones about personal choice and state authority. They were real arguments, made by real people with genuine commitments to individual liberty. They also encountered, over the following years, a body of evidence that was increasingly difficult to argue with. Seatbelt use rates went up substantially after the laws took effect, and traffic deaths per mile driven fell. The relationship was consistent enough across enough states, and enough years to be attributable to the law rather than to chance. Today, the seatbelt click is so deeply embedded in the experience of entering a car that it is essentially unconscious. The habit was not natural. It was not universal. It was built by a law that made a volunteer behavior mandatory, enforced it with fines, and over 2 or 3 decades converted an 11% habit into a 90% one. The thing that you now do without thinking, every time you get in a car, is something that the law had to require before most people would do it. The car is pulling out of the parking lot now. The seatbelt is clicked. The afternoon stretches ahead. And somewhere up the road, a group of college students who are old enough to vote, who can sign legal contracts, who are fully responsible for their actions under the law, are heading somewhere for the evening and are about to encounter a rule that says that something specific, a beer, is not available to them yet. It is a Friday evening in the autumn of 1985, and you are 19 years old, and the bar that the group in front of you has been going to for the past year has recently changed its policy in response to legislation that arrived from Washington, like whether inevitable once it was coming, irreversible once it arrived. The bouncer at the door is polite about it. The ID check is thorough. The minimum age is now 21. This is, if you think about it carefully, a genuinely peculiar position to occupy. The people in this group are legally adults. They are old enough to vote. 2 of them did in the last election. One of them enlisted in the Navy last spring and was home briefly for a holiday before returning to his assignment. All of them can enter into binding contracts, can be held fully criminally responsible for any crime they might commit, can get married, can take out loans, can be sued. They cannot, in most American states, as of this year, legally purchase a beer. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act of 1984 required states to set their minimum drinking age at 21 or lose 8% of their annual federal highway apportionment. The leverage was the same mechanism that had been used before. The federal government could not constitutionally mandate the drinking age directly. Alcohol regulation was reserved to the states by the 21st Amendment, but it could attach conditions to federal funding. States that declined to comply lost money. No state ultimately declined. The background was a specific and documented pattern in traffic deaths. After the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 in 1971, many states had also lowered their drinking ages to 18 or 19. The reasoning was consistent. If you were old enough to vote, old enough to serve in the military, old enough to bear full legal responsibility, you were old enough to make decisions about alcohol. What followed was carefully studied. Traffic fatalities among 18 to 20-year-olds increased in states that lowered the drinking age, and increased specifically in categories associated with drunk driving, when states that had lowered their ages began raising them back in the early 1980s. Before the federal act, traffic deaths in that age group went down again in those states. The pattern was consistent enough across multiple states and multiple years to be difficult to explain away. Candy Lightner's 13-year-old daughter, Carrie, was killed in May of 1980 by a drunk driver in Fair Oaks, California. The driver had 3 previous drunk driving offenses. Lightner founded Mothers Against Drunk Driving that same year. The organization became one of the most effective advocacy groups in American legislative history, combining personal grief, organized research, and skilled political work in ways that moved Congress with unusual efficiency. The National Minimum Drinking Age Act passed in 1984. By 1988, all 50 states had adjusted their laws to comply. Youth drunk driving deaths fell in the years that followed. The data was consistent. The neurological dimension of the argument arrived later, as brain imaging technology improved and developmental neuroscience accumulated evidence about the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain governing impulse control, risk assessment, and decision-making, which does not complete its development until the mid-20s. Research suggested that alcohol interacts with the developing brain in ways that create specific risks beyond those of adult drinking. This was not established with confidence in 1984, but became increasingly documented over the following decades and added a scientific dimension to what had begun as a traffic safety argument. The philosophical objection to 21 as a minimum age is the one that appears, in slightly varied costume, throughout almost everything we've discussed tonight. The rights of a legal adult to make decisions about their own life. The inconsistency of allowing someone to vote and serve in combat while restricting their access to beer. These are real objections. They are also encountered by a very specific piece of evidence. The drunk driving deaths of the 18 to 20-year-old age group that were documented across multiple states in multiple years, moving in direct response to the age limit that was set. The bouncer at the door is still polite about it. The Friday evening stretches on, and in the same city, through a different door, a different kind of air is being breathed, an air that carries something invisible in it. Something that has been part of the atmosphere in bars and restaurants and break rooms for so long that it has become invisible precisely because it is everywhere. And someone is about to measure what that atmosphere actually contains. The bar on a weekday evening in 1994 is the kind of bar that knows exactly what it is. The tables are wooden. The lighting is low enough to be comfortable without being so dim that the menu becomes a puzzle. The conversation from neighboring tables is the warm, indistinct buzz of people who have temporarily made this room their place for the evening. The air is slightly blue-gray. Not dramatically so, not the thick haze of a different era. But the quality of the air in the room is different from the air outside. Cumulative. The combined product of however many people are smoking this evening, layering into the ambient atmosphere of the room. You are breathing it whether you smoke or not. This is the detail that eventually changed everything about the smoking argument, not the smoker's right to make a decision about their own health. That remained a personal choice with documented personal consequences that adults were entitled to make. The question that shifted the law was the question of what the smoke did after it left the cigarette, and to whom, and whether those people had consented to inhale it. The Surgeon General's first formal report on smoking and health was published in January of 1964. It established a relationship between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, chronic bronchitis, emphysema, and coronary artery disease with a confidence that the scientific community was prepared to assert publicly. The tobacco industry had spent decades funding research designed to cast doubt on these connections, and the Surgeon General's report was the federal government's clearest statement that the doubt had not succeeded. For most of the 1960s and 1970s, the public health focus on smoking concerned the smoker. Advertising restrictions, warning labels, public information campaigns about the individual health risks of the habit. The conversation was framed around helping people quit, preventing young people from starting, and ensuring that those who chose to smoke did so with accurate information. Then the research on what was happening to the air around the smoker began to accumulate seriously. Studies through the 1970s and early 1980s documented that people who lived or worked in close proximity to smokers were experiencing elevated rates of lung cancer, heart disease, and respiratory illness in ways that could not be entirely explained by other risk factors. Children living in homes where adults smoked showed elevated rates of ear infections, asthma, and respiratory illness. The smoke was doing something to the people who didn't smoke but breathed the same air. The Environmental Protection Agency classified secondhand smoke as a Group A carcinogen in 1992. Group A is a category reserved for substances with the most established evidence of causing cancer in humans, the category that includes asbestos and benzene. The classification was not made lightly and was not made quickly. It followed years of review of a substantial body of research. The framing changed. Smoking in an enclosed shared space was no longer simply a personal health choice. It was an action with health consequences for everyone else in the room, imposed on them without their consent. The bar workers were the clearest illustration. A bartender working a standard week in a smoking-permitted bar was exposed to ambient tobacco smoke at levels estimated to be equivalent to approximately 2 packs per day, without having chosen to smoke a single cigarette. Without having accepted an occupational risk they were aware of when they took the job, and without any legal protection from a hazard that was, by the early 1990s, classified alongside industrial chemicals in terms of carcinogenic evidence. California enacted the first comprehensive statewide workplace smoking ban in 1995, covering restaurants and eventually bars as well. The opposition predicted economic devastation for the hospitality industry. Restaurant revenues in California went up after the ban. The predicted catastrophe did not occur. New York City banned smoking in bars and restaurants in March of 2003. The prediction was the same: empty bars, ruined nightlife, an industry in crisis. None of it happened. The bars stayed open. The bartenders kept their jobs. And measures of heart attack rates in New York City declined measurably in the years following the ban, in ways that researchers studying the data attributed in significant part to reduction in secondhand smoke exposure. The pattern repeated itself across every jurisdiction that enacted comprehensive smoking bans. The economic dire predictions were not borne out, and the public health improvements were. The aggregate evidence across dozens of cities and states was consistent enough to have influenced policy globally. The smoker standing outside the bar door in the cold, finishing a cigarette before returning inside, a figure that would have been incomprehensible in 1980 and is entirely ordinary now, represents the social compromise that emerged from the intersection of individual rights and collective air quality. The smoker retained the right to smoke. The right to smoke inside a shared space, into shared air, was narrowed. The bar is different now. The air inside is different. The century moved on, and with it, slowly and contentiously, into the mechanisms of law and evidence and sustained argument, the composition of the air that strangers share in a room together. The lights are very low now. We have been walking through a long and winding stretch of American history tonight, not through its famous battles or its celebrated speeches or its moments of bronze and marble, through its rules, its strange, peculiar, sometimes maddening rules that made people pause in the middle of ordinary life and ask what the government thought it was doing now. And what we found, when we looked carefully at each one, was not primarily stupidity or cruelty or religious mania or bureaucratic overreach, though elements of each of those things appeared along the way. What we found, underneath the strange surfaces, was anxiety. Every rule we looked at tonight was anxiety given legal form. The anxiety of a government staring at enormous unmapped wilderness, desperately broke, trying to organize enough of it to sell before the country defaulted on its debts. The anxiety of communities watching their educated men kill each other at dawn over slights to personal honor. The anxiety of working people with no guaranteed rest day and no law to secure one. The anxiety of a mail system flowing with genuine predation and no mechanism to stop it. The anxiety of a public health system watching ships arrive with no tools adequate to what they might be carrying. The anxiety of small businesses watching one company absorb their entire industry by methods that had no name yet, but that were recognized with the end of competition as a meaningful concept. The anxiety of parents buying medicine for their children that contained things nobody had told them about. The anxiety of Lewis Hine with his camera in a coal mine, try and make the public see something the public could, if it chose, look directly at. The anxiety of families for whom the saloon at the end of the block was a reliable agent of loss. Of pedestrians on streets filling with machines moving faster than anything had moved on streets before. Of federal workers being quietly organized into a political operation they had not signed up for. Of a country suddenly unable to buy gasoline at a price it could afford, looking for a fast, visible response. Of a highway patrol officer looking at motorcycle fatality statistics. Of a transportation researcher tracking seatbelt compliance in a country that wasn't complying. Of a mother in California in 1980. Try to understand what to do with grief of that particular kind. None of the rules we looked at tonight were perfect. Several of them were quite imperfect. Prohibition understood the problem and failed the solution catastrophically enough to become a synonym for the failure of top-down behavioral law. The Comstock Act correctly identified genuine predation in the mail and then became an instrument of censorship that damaged people it should have protected. The Ellis Island inspections tried to prevent epidemic disease and were simultaneously shaped by prejudices about national origin that had nothing to do with public health and everything to do with who the receiving society wished to admit. History does not deal in clean ledgers. It deals in people making decisions inside the circumstances they're actually in with the knowledge available to them, within the institutions they have, under pressures that look clearer from the outside from a comfortable distance of decades. What it deals in, most of all, is trying, imperfectly, sometimes badly, sometimes brilliantly by accident, sometimes arriving at the right answer through reasoning that was only partially correct, sometimes getting the answer wrong, and eventually being corrected by the evidence, or by the courts, or by the slow accumulation of public consensus that certain things were no longer acceptable. The grid still lies across the American Midwest. Its section lines running north and south and east and west. Its section 16ths long, since turned into something larger than a colonial schoolhouse, but fulfilling something like the original intention. The dueling code is gone, replaced by courts and mediators and strongly worded letters. The blue laws exist mostly in the memory of older Americans and in a few scattered alcohol sale restrictions on Sunday morning. The mail is regulated and the food is labeled and the patent medicines contain what the labels say they contain, mostly thanks to laws that extended from those 1906 foundations. The children in the mill districts went back to school, slowly, imperfectly, through laws that were challenged and struck down and eventually passed again and held. The seatbelt is clicked. The helmet is on. The speed limit, whatever it is tonight, is something that somebody once calculated against a set of real concerns. And the air in the bar is cleaner. The history is settling around you now like something that has been in the room the whole time, warm and familiar. Let it rest there. The grid lines are out in the dark somewhere, running perfectly north to south and east to west, making their small sideways correction at the correction lines where the curvature of the earth requires it, holding the shape of the land the way they have since 1785. The saloon on the corner has been a speakeasy and a bar, and is now something else entirely, but the building is still there. The mail is still moving. The factories have different rules now. The clocks are an hour off from where the sun says they should be, and have been for so long that most of us have stopped noticing. The past is strange, and the past is human, and the past is somewhere beneath its strange surface, always trying to make sense. Let the cities sleep. Let the roads be quiet for a while. Let the correction lines account for the curvature, wherever you are. Sleep well. We will be right here whenever you're ready for more.